Hello and good evening. As you can see, I've recovered virtually from COVID, and I hope you've had a good Easter break. So we need to crack on with the infectious diseases assignment. Now, I know that when we come back, we'll be doing question 2 and 3 from the aspects, but we'll also need to cover the assignment. So all of the resources are on the VLE, which you'll need to access. So let's first of all look at the assignment. Okay, so as you can see, it's 3,500 words. It's supposed to be done in the style of a booklet, okay, for voluntary workers overseas. So what I suggest to do is that you put in a title page with the infectious diseases and its control, and some nice pictures of bacteria, viruses, and different diseases, etc. Now, I'm going to follow the brief as the exam board have set out. It's fairly logical, although I would probably do a slightly different order. So the 4 PowerPoints that I've created on the VLE and these videos will follow the format that we've got here. Don't forget that I think it's on the 4th video, right at the very end, you will need to copy this table and fill it out. And I've now done that in the last set of PowerPoints, in number 4, and I've defined each of those types of immunity and given examples. Please remember that this has got to be your own work. You can't just use my PowerPoints. You can't just use the exam board's workbook that's also on the VLE. You must do some research. Now, I have put some web addresses in text, so if you want to have a look at those, please do, but it has to be in your own words, okay? And remember, word count at the end, and your references in a list, Harvard reference, alphabetical order. Okay. Okay. There are 5 different assessment criteria, or learning outcomes, I should say, and you can see the actual assessment criteria 1.1 down to 5.1 on the actual brief. Okay, so I'm going to stop that there, and let's have a look at another slide that I've got here. Now, this is what I've had to do is just screenshot this because it's a PDF file and I couldn't get it up. So this is the workbook that's on the VLE. Okay, some of it's useful, but you might want to have a look at it if you want extra notes. But remember, do not copy, all right, because it's the Ascentus work. If you do quote from it, remember to reference. Okay, but that's what it looks like, and that's also on the VLE. So let's get on with the PowerPoint. Okay, so infectious diseases, there's the code, human physiology. So this is part 1 that I'm doing, and each one will remind you it's a maximum of 3,500 words, 6 credit assignment. So What are pathogens and infectious diseases? So this booklet is designed for those health professionals that volunteer overseas as health workers. Now, we may well be familiar ourselves because of past experiences or family members over numerous infectious diseases with our own geographical area. So, for example, the UK or Europe. However, may end up in other countries yourself. And here there are infectious diseases unheard of in the UK. It's one of the reasons why Liverpool has the School of Tropical Medicine being a port. So historically, we used to get people coming into Liverpool with particular diseases from all over the world. Now, this booklet hopes to help with that transition of people that are used to working in the UK, then working over seas. So bear that in mind when you're writing this. So pathogens, what are they and how do they cause disease? So we're looking at assessment criteria 1.1. Now remember, you can subhead it 1.1 and then you can take those out after the draft so that you know you've covered all the assessment criteria. So first, we must get away from the idea that all microbes and living things are pathogenic, but because they're just not. Some are very useful, such as fungi that produce some of our antibiotics. Others help in the fermentation of sugars to form alcohol and bread. And quite a few microbes also break down waste, releasing nutrients back into the soil and the water. So microbes can also be helpful. However, there are others that cause disease and harm. So those are deemed pathogenic. So a pathogen is simply defined as an organism that has the potential to cause infectious diseases in its host, i.e. us. Most pathogens are able to avoid the immune system's response to the host, triggering associated illnesses. It sometimes takes time for our immune system to actually overcome the pathogen in question. Now, the pathogen utilizes the host body's resources. So it's using you, awful to think, as food. And it uses those resources to reproduce, or in a case of a virus, replicate before exiting and spreading to new hosts, so other humans. But remember, you can get cross-contamination between humans and animals, animals and humans, okay? So pathogens are of different types and can spread through various means, usually skin contact, bodily fluids, so saliva, blood, semen, even feces, or contact with contaminated surfaces. Here I'm touching the deck at my table. It's pretty clean. That is our house, but some may be contaminated. So things like door handles, loo seats, things like this. So that's where we have to be careful and always wash our hands. So the most common types of pathogens are viruses, bacteria and fungi. However, we can also include organisms like protozoans. They're jelly-like animals that are microscopic, usually waterborne. All right, but there's also round and flat worms that can also infect us. And we also include in there ticks and lice, biting insects that can carry disease, but they can actually invade our body or on our body, lice and ticks. Anyone that's had dogs may know about ticks, because they can be transferred. Okay, so here we have a picture of a virus such as COVID influenza, what we normally call flu, or even rabies, which usually starts off in things like dogs or bats and can be transferred through their bites to humans. Very nasty diseases, rabies. Luckily, as an island, we've kept it out, although you do find it on some parts of the mainland Europe. But we have got a grip of it in the last 50 years. Next picture shows us bacteria. In this case, it's Streptococcus. So this is Streptococcus pneumoniae, the bacteria that causes pneumonia. There are viral forms as well. But this Streptococcus means chains. So that's why you can see this long bead-like structure. But they're also responsible for things like strep throats and strepsils, because we can get a strep infection in our throat. Now, ringworm is really a misterm because it's not a worm. It's actually a fungal disease of the skin caused by a fungus and belongs to the family Tinea. Okay, now there are other fungal diseases as well, Candida, that can cause things like thrush, etc., and also oral Candida you can get. I can remember seeing, as a young student, a fungus known as mossy foot, which was a tropical disease, turned the foot absolutely bright green. Then at the bottom here, we've got a diagram showing red blood cells and these tail possessing protozoans known as trypanosome that cause things like sleeping sickness. There are other protozoans that cause a South American disease known as Chagas disease, and of course the protozoan Plasmodium malariae, which causes malaria. And there are lots of different amoebas in that family of Plasmodium, as we'll see, that can cause malaria to varying degrees. At any one time, there's about 300 to 500 million people infected with malaria, and can cause anything between 700,000 and 1 million deaths per year. And it is preventable with things like anti-malarial drugs, but even simpler are things like mosquito nets and cost very little. Okay, moving on. Okay, horrible to think this is someone's intestine, absolutely packed full of intestinal worms. In this case, the Latin name Ascaris lumbricoides. Okay, but there's also the tapeworm, the Taenia solium, which comes from pigs. Here we can see a tapeworm. Some of these can be meters in length. We've also got burrowing worms, nasty things like Draculacolus medicinalis, which is the guinea worm. And this is actually someone's foot. And here we can see a health professional actually slowly pulling out the worm from the wound here that you can see in their leg and foot. Normally, they're kind of like in fields and water sources, and the worm literally burrows into the skin and starts to grow, but it will start to block blood vessels, etc. So that's why it's removed, and we have to draw the thing out very slowly. So once we've discussed the range of pathogens, and remember that 1.1 is the danger point because people go into lots and lots of detail, but remember you're only looking at the range of pathogens, okay? So this is why in these slides we actually looked at those pathogens all right, of viruses, bacteria, fungi, protozoans, and then the worms, okay? So don't go into lots and lots of detail. You can always come back to it if you think, oh, I need to boost the word count up, and give a few more examples of diseases caused by these pathogens, okay? So in 1.2, we need to move on to how, and the emphasis is on how do pathogens cause disease. So worms and protozoans can cause disease and damage to the body in several ways. Some block blood vessels and lymph vessels, while others deprive the body of nutrients or produce toxins. In the case of the malarial parasite, it actually alters the it feeds on the blood, and so therefore the actual patient has severe fatigue and cramp because there aren't enough blood vessels to carry the oxygen. Really painful disease and can be life-threatening. Okay. Because worms are large and often migrate through the body, they can cause damage to the host tissues directly by their activity or by their metabolism. In other words, they're drawing the nutrients off you. It's hard to think now, but Victorian women used to ingest small tapeworms so that they could diet. Horrible, because normally now if someone has a tapeworm, they're removed surgically, because if you don't remove the tiny pinhead of the actual head that hooks into your small intestines, it will just keep growing again. So the Victorians used to use a really noxious drug that paralyzed the tapeworm, but if you got the dosage wrong, you'd actually paralyze the patient. So wouldn't advise it to anybody thinking a method of dieting is using tapeworm, although I do hear you can still get them on the internet. So damage also occurs indirectly as a result of the host's defense mechanism. Almost all the organ systems can be affected. And there you can see a website that I've put there that looks at these. Okay. So remember, not all microbes, such as fungi, bacteria, and viruses, are pathogenic, and some are helpful in nature. Those that are dangerous, pathogenic, do us harm. And that's the thing about pathogenic. All right, they do us harm. Other bacteria, your skin, for example, is absolutely covered in bacteria, but we've evolved to grow used to these bacteria, and a lot of them actually outcompete pathogens because they're quite happy, our skin keeps them at bay, and so sometimes they can be quite useful. But all of these are going to be important to health professionals. Now, we need to relate the structure to how they actually survive in the body and produce disease. So it possesses specific structures and processes that help them survive. Because remember, our body's going to defend itself, so it needs structures and mechanisms to kind of like evade those. So firstly, bacteria can grow and divide rapidly. Given the right conditions, i.e. food and optimum temperature, they will produce a new bacterium in 20 minutes. Some are even faster. So given enough nutrients, in theory, all right, a bacterium in 24 hours, doubling every 20 minutes, would produce over 7 sextillion bacteria. So that's a 7 with, as you can see here, 21 zeros. Okay. Now, of course, all right, that number will be reduced as some die, there's not enough nutrients to grow, the temperature's not right, or the body's defenses start to kill them off. Now, to help the bacteria survive, there are a number of structures to prevent or delay our body's defenses. Now, over here, I've also said that the bacteria can be classified in different ways. One, by their shape. If they're round or cocci, or spheres, cocci, so we have diplococci, 2 round bacteria joined together, streptococci in these beads, okay, or chains, a tetrad, all right, 4 together. Staphylococcus actually means grape-like cluster, so they look like a bunch of grapes. And Sarcina, all right, looks like a cube, okay. Now rods look like, all right, like my mouse here, that would be rod-shaped, okay, all right, or my glass case, rod-shaped. So sometimes you get chains of bacilli, like the one that causes anthrax, Bacillus anthraxia, Salmonella typhi, which causes salmonella food poisoning and has flagella. And then you get spore formers like Clostridium botulinum. Clostridium botulinum produces one of the most powerful poisons known to man. It's incredibly poisonous. We don't hear of it, luckily enough, very often in the country, because our food processing is so much better and our hygiene laws. However, in my younger day, there were several cases where a can might split, and even now you should avoid cans that are dented, particularly ones that contain meat, because Clostridium botulinum could actually invade the can and cause severe problems. There was an outbreak up in Scotland about 20 years ago with contaminated meat. Spirals, all right, Vibrio cholera, those are also, they're seen as very pathogenic bacteria. And the spirochetes, things like syphilis is a spirochete. So it's this kind of like little wavy structure, almost looks worm-like, but microscopic. Okay. So looking at the bacterium image on the right-hand side here, we can see a structure known as a pilus. Okay. Now, there are a number of these on the surface of the bacterium. So we would say there is a number of pili because that's plural. Now, some of those pili are specialized to help the bacteria adhere. That means stick to the host. Okay. Such pili that help them do this are known as fimbri or fimbari for the plural, or fimbria for singular. Now, these allow the bacterium to draw nutrients, so they will allow them to start taking all the nutrients out of your cell and cause damage. Now, also on the image opposite, you can see a cell wall. Here it's labeled. Now, we came across cell walls. We had prokaryotic cells, and they have a protective cap and also a protective capsule. Now, both of these slow down our white blood cells from attacking the bacterium, giving it more time to survive, and allows other bacteria to reproduce so the infection continues. Now, hopefully the body's defenses overcome them before they cause too much harm. So you might have a poorly tummy for a day or so. But some bacteria also contain an extra slime layer, and that also designed to delay the attack from our white blood cells, particularly phagocytes that try to engulf them. And finally, on our picture here, okay, and remember this is what you should be doing, referring to your diagram, okay. I've no problem in people using this because it's freely available, is this diagram on the internet, but you can find others, and I would encourage you to do that research. Now, finally, some bacteria possess a flagellum. Remember that tail-like structure at the end here, the flagellum, as I'm pointing to? That helps them to swim and therefore travel and avoid white blood cells as far as possible. Moving on to viruses. Okay, again on 1.2, we're looking at the structure. Here we can see typical structure of a virus. Okay, has a viral envelope made up of lipids and fatty acids, actually taken from us as hosts. So it's actually using our materials. And then it has surface proteins that the virus recognize and bind to the cells in the host. However, it's also the means by which our white blood cells recognize an invading particle, such as a virus. And these are known as antigenic proteins. They produce an antibody. We talk about the antigen-antibody reaction. And of course, they can also contain things called spike proteins, which allow them to pierce our cell and get in. Because once it's got in through our membrane, it will inject its nuclear material. Now, some viruses contain DNA, that's that deoxyribonucleic acid, and some viruses are RNA, which is ribonucleic acid, but it's the genetic material. So let's have a look at the text. Some scientists have suggested that viruses should not be classed as living things, as they don't possess the normal attributes associated with living things. Now, this is a scientific argument, which, although interesting, we need not discuss at this point. For this assignment, the word that we associate with producing another virus, i.e. reproduction, will not be used because it's not really a type of reproduction. Instead, a virus uses the host's DNA and all the other cell mechanisms in the host cell to produce replicas of itself. Hence, a virus uses the process of replication. I liken it to a photocopier. So if I wanted to photocopy the brief here, I put it on, all right, the photocopier that's acting as the cell, I press it and off it goes. It actually reproduces copies of the virus. So the virus possesses structures that allow it to enter the body's cells, and these proteins known as spike proteins that allow it to puncture and enter the host cell. And then the virus possesses enzymes that aid its entry. Once it takes over the cell's nucleus and starts to replicate itself, eventually there'll be so many virus particles that the cell bursts, and each new virus will then infect other host cells. As the virus is in the host cell, it means that the body has no choice but to destroy its own infected cells. Because remember that the white blood cells are outside in the bloodstream, okay? And what happens is an infected cell, it kind of like is saying, oh, I'm infected, I'm going to put that on top of my cell, all right, to say, I'm infected, please you need to destroy me because I've got all these viruses in me. And the cells sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the body. Of course, sometimes the viral infection is so severe the body just cannot cope, and that's where we have to start using drugs, etc. Okay, so 11 slides. That really is it for the variety of pathogens, our bacteria, our viruses, our fungi, our worms. And then we've concentrated on the structure, all right, of two of those, the bacteria and the virus, and how their structure allows them to be pathogenic by taking over our cells or disrupting our metabolism or using our cells as food, etc. Okay, so that's the end of the first video, and I'll see you in part 2. All right, the revenge of pathogens, or the body in this case. Okay, so good evening, and I'll see you soon.